I remember when I was in Vienna when I was 21, and there was a lot of news about the Berlin Wall, and saying to my friend's father, "Do you really think that the Berlin Wall will come down?" And he said, "No, that'll never happen in our lifetimes." 3 weeks later, it happened. And 3 days after that, we were at dinner, and he was saying, "Well, of course it was always going to happen." What happened there was that it was the tipping point. His viewpoint shifted after it happened. The impossible became possible, and then it became completely a new normative for him. But there were certain people on the front line that had already grasped that the impossible will become possible, and indeed made it happen. They were the ones that were there that actually pulled down the wall. They had the vision of what was possible already in place. They were the innovators, the early adopters who knew what was possible, and they were going to make it happen. They were the change makers.
Welcome, dear hearts. It was so beautiful and connecting to be back in person and at a festival this past weekend. I loved hosting our panel discussion on rewilding ourselves at Noisily Festival. The theme of the Mind, Body, Soul area this year was We Are Nature, curated so well by our wonderful Helly Cameron. I loved our conversation here with Charlotte Pulver, Bruce Parry, Mish Denny, Melanie Kay, and Helen Sue. Some key takeaways were on the power of community, making choices to expand your consciousness, and letting yourself live a life of wonder and love with nature. I hosted a workshop on my book Intuition 2 that was really powerful, as we shared space with questions on how to live with our intuitive intelligence activated. Something that I really believe is a necessary skill of these times. Next up is Buddha Fields, where I'll be hosting a workshop on intuition and an All That We Are panel on anchoring ourselves in these times. That was the theme that came to me that felt the most useful to offer. My guests will be Andy Reingold and Eileen Hall, and perhaps a secret surprise guest that may come together in the coming days. Here are the words that I wrote for the session. We are living in more chaotic and challenging times, with rising issues such as climate change, the refugee crisis, and cost of living. What is sacred activism at this time, and how do we evolve and adapt in a way that is grounded and useful? How do we find that balance between the desire to change the world and the mounting number of issues with which we feel powerless? Join us for this discussion to share how we have been navigating the past year and how to be anchors in amongst it all. This idea of being an anchor of the future is feeling really strong with me at the moment, that we have such power and choice with what we do right now and how that can anchor into what is possible. For those of you coming to Buddha Fields, you can find the timings on amisha.co.uk for those workshops. This week, Polly Higgins was strongly in my heart. I am writing a profile on her alongside some other incredible people for The Radicals, which is a storytelling initiative powered by the Guerrilla Foundation that explores contemporary radicalism, reclaims what it means to be radical, showcases the diverse faces of root cause activism worldwide, and tells fucking inspiring and authentic stories that are meant to reframe activists, uproot misconceptions, and reroute rebellions. This project has 3 main objectives. I'm a collaborator of this project, we seek to reclaim what it is to be radical, challenge the current biases around radicalism that is currently pigeonholed into being a rioter or violence and aggression in protesting and fundamentalism, usually of a religious persuasion. Instead, shift the narrative to systemic thinking, tackling root causes behind global shitstorms, and shaking established, antiquated foundations with a bold, badass attitude and fresh, creative tactics. Lionize radical doers and those on the forefront of current social movements. The more obscure, the better, because we want to shine a light on those working in the shadows, as long as it's consensual. Showcase the diversity that exists in activist communities with a focus on origin stories, thus inspiring others to action, and the realization that there are many niches in activism, all interdependent, all necessary. As we now have over 150 episodes of this podcast, I know that some of the earlier ones can get buried in the archives. This episode was originally episode 42, and it's one of the most beautiful and inspiring ones that we have, and it feels just as relevant today as it did then. And so I want to share it with you so that you can listen in and see what moves for you. Some of you will be hearing this for the first time, and others of you will have heard this before, but I trust that it will be helpful and useful to listen again in this particular junction that we find ourselves in. The whole project of All That We Are is radical in its own nature. There are so many ways that we're disrupting what is common and usual in media and tech, having an all-female team, having a majority women of color team, working through different time zones, not accepting advertising, and sharing the stories that don't always get airtime that are so important. Making this space for community to come together. As you know, you can join our membership if you want to become a deeper part of our community and be part of the social network as well as all of our events. What is radical about Polly is that when she gets the message, the earth needs a lawyer, she goes for it, changes her life, and becomes what she knows the earth needs. Many of you will know that Polly died in April 2019, and that this was one of the last interviews she gave before she became ill. Her work has been continued with Stop Ecocide by her co-founder Jojo Mehta and their amazing team. You can go to stopecocide.earth and become an earth protector, as well as find many other ways to get involved. And so my guest today is earth lawyer Polly Higgins. This was recorded in late 2018 in her office in Stroud. I remember it so clearly as a branch landed on the windscreen of my car as I was driving from Devon to Stroud to have this conversation. And so I arrived a little bit whiplashed and a little bit out of my body, and Polly was so kind and so welcoming. The campaign to make ecocide a crime was the life's work of UK barrister and visionary, the late Polly Higgins. She spent her last decade making the word ecocide globally understood by giving talks, making documentaries, and advising governments. Along the way, she inspired thousands, from parliamentarians to ecologists, and from lawyers to artists. She devoted all her time and unquenchable spirit to one client, the earth. Polly presented a definition of ecocide to the UN Law Commission in 2010, reading as follows: ecocide is extensive loss, damage, or destruction of ecosystems of a given territory or territories, such as the peaceful enjoyment of the inhabitants has been or will be severely diminished. It was to this definition that Pope Francis referred in his call for ecocide to become a crime in November 2019. Polly was diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer in March 2019. She passed away peacefully just a month later on Easter Sunday. Her warmth, determination, and positivity remained undimmed to the end, and she lived to see her call to stop ecocide taken to the streets by Extinction Rebellion. Polly's spirit lives in everyone who knows that serious harm to the earth must be named and prevented. It's our job to ensure that destroying nature becomes a crime. It won't just be the law that changes then, but the whole course of history. In this conversation entitled Tipping Points of Radical Change, we explore the themes of ecocide, climate breakdown, and purposeful living as we speak to the question, how do we harness our life force to protect the earth? I hope that this conversation inspires you to be an earth protector and to live out the intuitive guidance that you have of how you can best serve these times. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration. The spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share, that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. And we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible. I'm delighted, Polly, to be here in your office with you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, well, thank you very much. It's a delight to have you here. And please, not an office. This is our heart quarters.
We're sat on the floor underneath an angel and a sign that says trees have rights too.
Yeah.
So it's how offices perhaps could be.
Exactly. Yeah. This is a lot of magic happens in this room, and yeah, we really love it. It's a very beautiful space, and that matters a lot to me, to be somewhere that's harmonious, that people enjoy being in. Sometimes people walk in and they say, wow, you live here. Well, yeah, during the day I do.
Yeah, it's interesting that we put effort into how our homes look, and then there's a way that offices should be.
Yeah, which is really cold and functional and unattractive, really lacking in comfort and beauty, and really lacking in intimacy. So this is absolutely the opposite of that, I hope. It's meant to be a safe, intimate space that is enjoyable and full of love and light and laughter.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like having this kind of environment helps you to work better as a team and to...
Yeah, we have a lot of... we are actually very harmonious as a team. And in part, it's our surroundings, but also I think because we have common intent as well, we're very aligned with our values and in understanding of what we're doing and helping me take Ecocide law forward, which is really fantastic. But also it's that thing of, if we spend most of our waking hours in a given place, then obviously you do want it to be somewhere that you really love being in, rather than somewhere that you're just looking forward to the end of the day to get out of. I was saying to you that sofa is designed, well, we chose it because it's super big, so you can sleep on it if need be. If someone needs to have a kip during the day, then we do, and we can cuddle up under a blanket. That's great. Or, if one of the team's kids are here, they can go and watch a film over there. Things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that you can be a human whilst you're at work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Can you take us kind of into, I guess, the beginning of Ecocide? And for this show, it's about people coming in at this. Some may know a lot about climate change and all of the movements around it, and others may not. So I'd love for it to just be really open and for us to bring everyone in and up to speed.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, my background is as a barrister, which in the UK is a court advocate, a court lawyer. I found myself actually getting increasingly concerned with what was happening in the world. This is about maybe 15, 18 years ago, spending more time actually kind of clocking what was going on. I'm with George Monbiot, one of our UK journalists, in this, that climate change is such a deeply inappropriate term for it. It's climate breakdown. Seeing this happening and understanding that this was actually occurring as a result of predominantly dangerous industrial activity. As a barrister, I was also representing big transnational companies in court, and people that I would get on with. We would really, obviously I was advising them in capacity as a lawyer and representing them, but I was beginning to wonder, why was it that it was so accepted as a normative for some of these companies that were really causing massive destruction in the world, that good people could be working within these companies and think it was completely acceptable. And that really bothered me. What happened was I actually got to what I now know is a critical choice point in my life. Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey when we step out of our ordinary life into the extraordinary. And that happened to me literally in court one day when I was waiting for judgment in London in the Royal Courts of Justice and the Court of Appeal for a case I had been representing an individual for 3 years who'd been very badly injured and harmed in the workplace. A space opened up. The judges were late coming back into the courtroom. The courtroom is very high up, and I looked out of the windows like here, out across the rooftops, and in my mind's eye, I found myself soaring up and out of London and across the world, and I could see the Amazon, I could see the destruction, I could see Central South America, I could see across to India, I could see up to North America, to the Athabasca tar sands in Canada, I could see the frack fields, I could see the unconventional oil extraction, I could see the melting ice up in the Arctic. I found myself thinking the earth's in need of a good lawyer. And that actually changed my life, that thought. After that court case, literally I came out of that court case, which I had won in part, and I actually had even changed the law. As a result of the judgment, the Court of Appeal were with me on one of my legal arguments. And I came walking back from the court to my chambers, where my clerks who deal with your diaries for the cases, they were absolutely over the moon for me. They were saying, "This is really fantastic. Miss, you can take on the biggest cases now. You're a leading junior. All the QCs, the kind of top barristers will want to have you working on their cases." And I said, "Yeah, I'm going to take a year out." And they thought I was absolutely crazy. And what had happened was, walking down the road, was that thought, the earth is in need of a good lawyer, crystallized into a question. And the question was, how do we create a duty of care, a legal duty of care for the earth? And that was my critical choice point moment. I could have just left it hanging in the air and walked away into getting paid very well as a top-notch lawyer. But the quest had been set, because the quest always starts with a question, you see. And out of that question comes the journey. And I heard the call, if you will. So I stepped off my mainstream, my ordinary life, if you like, and stepped into the extraordinary, which of course is when the challenges then just begin. That was 2005 when that happened. This is now the end of 2018. And through that journey, now, I mean, it was back in 2009, I proposed Ecocide become an international crime, to create a legal duty of care, or more specifically, the duty, the responsibility to uphold a higher principle of first do no harm, and to prohibit dangerous industrial activity, to prohibit extensive damage, destruction to a loss of ecosystems, to prohibit the exacerbation of climate change through dangerous industrial activity, and to protect our earth. That really was the answering of the question, how do we create the legal duty of care to protect the earth? And that's about governance of, if you like, earth rights. What you're seeing behind you in the lovely banner that was made some years ago for me, Trees of Rights too. The idea that it's not just human rights, but it's earth rights. But actually, rights is only one half of the equation. You can be up the top of a mountain saying, I have the right to life, and someone comes and shoots you. It's only because it's a crime to take the life, to commit murder, that there is a governance, there is a protection of your life. If there is no governance there by it being a crime, no duty of care that's enforced through a responsibility provision, then your rights mean nothing. Then you can be shot, and that would be that. And indeed, yes, of course, people still shoot and kill, but it's about accountability. For want of, having an argument in the kitchen and taking that knife, you'll think twice rather than stab it in your partner if you're really angry, as opposed to making a meal with it.
There's a moral code.
Exactly.
You don't do that.
Exactly. And that moral code is then translated into a legal criminal code.
Yeah.
Because criminal law is about justice and it is about protecting society. And what I recognise is that only gets us so far, because it's also about protecting our earth, our ecology, the non-human inhabitants of this world, as well as the human inhabitants. So ecocide crime, I proposed into the United Nations back in 2010 to become an international crime. And that's what I've been spending my last 8 years very solidly working on, to take that forward.
And there's so many things that I love about what you've shared. I think a lot of us have those moments where maybe an idea comes in as we're staring out the window.
Yeah.
Not many of us take the risk.
Yeah.
And that in itself is inspiring, and that you didn't put it off. You didn't say, oh, I'll just get to the next rung in my career and then I'll do this. You're just like, no, today it's happening. Yes. I heard it. I'm listening.
Yeah.
I feel like we've all got a lot to learn from that, of catching those moments of inspiration and catching that direction that we get towards our purpose.
Yeah. I was most definitely standing on a precipice at that moment. And I looked into the unknown to see what could be done to make this world a more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, as my friend Charles says.
Yeah.
It wasn't conscious at that time. It's only been in later years that it's been pointed out to me that is what has happened, that it was that critical choice point. And it is said that we have maybe 6 or 7 opportunities in our lives to step into that tiny window of opportunity, which will completely change our lives and the lives of others around us. And you can go through a life missing each and every single one, or you can capture it and you can step in, so that then the next one, when it comes along, you begin to recognize, I'm again standing on the precipice. I'm going to step into the unknown here.
And you get to know that feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And you feel it in your body and you're like, okay, here we go. Let's go.
Yeah. Exactly.
For those of us that are trying to do our bit, I mean, I also hate to call it climate change, and I hate to talk about it as an environmental issue, because it really is the heart of our existence. Yeah. That we live on a planet, we drink water, we eat food, everything that we do, the basis of our humanity is in relation to Earth. Yeah. And yet it's thought of as this thing that you section away. And there are just some people that are into it, environmentalists, which is completely bizarre when you really look at it, even though society makes it seem completely normal. Mm-hmm. The narrative is, well, okay, if you care about this, then you're going to, not use plastic bottles. And there are all these things that you can do, these small things. Mm-hmm. There are challenges of doing them. And I feel like there's a sense of, of just right action, like you try and do your bit. But there's also a knowing that it doesn't all add up. Even if we all stopped buying plastic bottles, it wouldn't stop the plastic bottles being made and created and put in the shops. That basic economics of supply and demand that perhaps we learnt at school isn't actually the way that the world works.
Precisely.
It can leave us feeling quite helpless in terms of, well, what can we do? I just love that. I feel like the law is such a powerful tool in all of this. And the fact that you saw that as one woman, you saw that and you looked into that and you created support around you and you just started that conversation and action into making that happen.
For me, I thought I'd take a year out. And I'm still in my year out. And as I had to admit to my bank manager a few years back, when she said, Polly, when are you going to get back to making lots of money on really big cases? And I said, this is way too late. I'm on a completely different trajectory now. This is what really matters and has purpose for me. It's a strange thing because also, for me, it's not about whether or not you're an environmentalist. It's far simpler than that. It's whether or not you care. And if you care, then you can move mountains. And any mother knows that in the world. You care, you protect for your child, and you will move mountains if need be to ensure that your child is protected. And in a way, anyone who's in that position or role of caring, and fathers too, but particularly for women as well, it's genetically embedded within us. We are the primary carers, we're the carriers of life for 9 months. We are the ones that are actually connected through the umbilical cord to new life. That sense of deep nurturing and deep care, the capacity to deeply protect, it is to extend that from not just our child but to the earth is a very natural instinct. And for many women in particular, that they can be constrained by just having to run to stand still because they haven't got enough money, because they're a single mom, or there's not enough income in the house, or whatever. They just don't have access to living more in harmony ecologically with the world, that they're just kind of trapped in a system that's not of their own making. And if they had a choice, they would have it differently. And I think often that sense of actually being scared of stepping off that little wheel that we just have to run and run and run beyond, it's very fearful. There's a whole world that's pushing us into saying, no, it's normal to go into a supermarket. It's normal to have lots of packaging on everything. And if you don't have access to the world's best, ecological markets like we do here in Stroud, then it becomes very difficult. And especially if you've got to get kids to, primaries and and running around all over the place, and actually financially it's not going to work to have to get away over there 20 miles away to just get something ecological, then you're stuck in that system, not of your own making. And that's the thing, is that actually, in a way, it's the deep care that matters more than anything else. And the ability to stand up and say, I've had enough. I'm not going to let this happen in my life anymore, when it becomes too untenable. That's in essence what I was doing in that moment. I was saying, I'm not going to take this. I'm not going to submit to the overwhelm of this world as being destroyed in front of me. My skills are, as a lawyer, so I wanted to see how I could find what laws there could be to protect the earth. And indeed, I discovered that we have missing law. They didn't exist. Hence, I ended up getting to a point of realizing that I'm the one that's going to have to create them. Mm-hmm. In a way, it is giving yourself that space, that moment to say, I am prepared to step into my higher purpose, because that's what this is all about. To actually step off a life more ordinary onto the life of it being extraordinary. We dare ourselves to be great, if you like, to step into our fullness of being, refuse to accept the norm of what is. I'll give you an example. We were talking about this earlier today. Any mother will understand this. If you were to discover that your child was being sexually abused by your partner, you wouldn't turn around to the partner and say, would you mind doing it a little less? You wouldn't turn around and say, because I love you, I'm going to let you continue doing it. You would protect your child. You would say, this has to stop. And you may do it in many different ways. You may shout, you may scream, you may pick up the phone to the police, what have you. But your natural instinct will be to protect the vulnerable. And even if it's someone that you perceive and love, you won't let that continue, because it is a harm. If your moral radar is strong, you will say, this has to stop. And it's that same driving motivation that that has taken me forward in looking at the earth and what's happening in the earth and saying, this has to stop. I refuse to see this. It's an abuse of our beautiful earth to exploit, to violate our earth in the way that this is happening. And the major perpetrators are big transnational corporations, fossil fuel extraction, Monsanto, industrialized agriculture, ExxonMobil. It's a reckless disregard because they do know, these companies know that it's causing harm. And such is the disconnect that it continues, but also such is the normative of it, it's been legalized. It is lawful to do that. It's perfectly fine to do it because it's not a crime. It hasn't been criminalized. So that's what I'm doing, is taking that law forward to ensure that we do put in place a crime at the very top end, because actually this is an atrocity crime. It affects the whole wider community, the earth community. It affects humanity as a whole to destroy our earth in this way, and continually with reckless disregard for the consequences. And why is it that, someone should be accountable for theft or hitting someone or actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, and yet the most serious harm of all, the continual destruction of our earth, the continual production of dangerous industrial activity that gives rise to excess greenhouse gases, that's exacerbating climate breakdown, is allowed to continue unabated for want of it not being recognised as the atrocity crime that it is. So for me, this is really, it's common sense. We put in place criminal law when we get to a point. There's a Latin phrase, when malum in se becomes malum prohibita, when something is so wrong in itself, we must prohibit it. And that's precisely the point we have reached now with both ecological and climate ecocide. And we draw a red line. We say, enough, no more. We don't go there. Like genocide. We don't turn around and say, okay, you can gas half the Jews, but not all of them. Of course not. That would be ridiculous. But it's rather like saying, okay, you can reduce your fossil fuel extraction, do a little less by 2050. That's no good. You're just going to do it a little bit slower. It's still wrong. It's still harmful. It's still a violation. So it's really about it's about recognizing that this is about accountability at the very top end. It's about corporate accountability. It's about state accountability as well. It's not about adaptation. It's about protecting our earth and our humanity and our future generations and the Indigenous world. It's something that's actually, in truth, to put it in place, is incredibly simple. It's the political will. And that depends on social license. That depends on society now saying, yes, we want this law put in place. And that's what we're now working on with the campaign.
Yeah, but it's so heartbreaking that governments aren't doing more.
Yeah.
Because you can kind of understand the corporations not doing more, although we know that those corporations are made up of humans that also have kids and families.
Sure.
But the sense that we aren't being protected by our governments, and we're at a critical point where in 11 years there are island nations that are likely to be underwater.
Yeah, absolutely.
And many other things that are due to happen actually very soon. And yet the process seems very slow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are reasons for that. Climate negotiations is just that, it's a negotiation, and the earth is not up for a negotiation. It's set up on the basis that you can bring as many negotiators to the table as you can finance. So America brings 2,000. Some of the small island developing states have one negotiator for 5 states. When you have 34 working group meetings, which one do you go to? And often you're not in the right one where the text is being amended so that protection of your people is written out of it. Migration with dignity just doesn't come into it. Adaptation, well, how do you adapt to your country being underwater? You don't. It does become an existential humanitarian crisis for those small island developing nations that are on the front line. In fact, we refer to them as great ocean states because they are, yes, the tiniest states in the world that are on the front line, but they're not the ones that are generating the greenhouse gas emissions that are exacerbating climate breakdown. They're the ones that are suffering the most, and they're the ones that are actually being protected the least. So how do we ensure that they have, if you like, almost a protected status in all of this, because they are the climate vulnerable? That's where Ecocide law comes into its own. But one of the biggest hurdles I met in taking this forward and taking it into the International Criminal Court was that these tiniest islands in the world, their seats would be empty at the annual assembly. And I realized that they weren't attending partly because they don't have genocide, they don't have war crimes, they don't have crimes against humanity. And they have climate ecocide, but that's not an international crime yet. So there was no reason for them to turn up to talk about genocide. But for them to come to talk about climate ecocide, it was just too expensive for them to even get any delegates over for the meetings. So this is, again, one of the issues that we were hitting was that how do we actually finance the very countries that require this law the most to actually take this forward into the International Criminal Court? And that's why we set up Mission Life Force, so that we could protect those who are most vulnerable on the front line and help finance them to come forward into the International Criminal Court and call for ecocide to be tabled as an international crime to protect them.
So can you give us a quick overview in what it takes to create an international law?
Yeah, it's actually, it's amazingly simple. It requires one head of state who is a member of the International Criminal Court, in the 124 countries that are, one head of state to propose it. Once that happens, it moves very quickly. Then within 3 months, all other countries are notified and it will go to either a review conference or the next assembly. So within literally months, you will have a conference where a proposed draft will then be taken forward. And once that's agreed by 2/3, then it's tabled. And then it's just a matter of signatories accruing. It can be very, very fast. Crimes of aggression, which was just signed off in December 2017, that was a 2-year process, the final stage of it. So we're looking at something that can happen very, very quickly here. It doesn't have to be long drawn out. Also, because it becomes an international crime, then it's automatically has to be transposed into national law for all the countries that are signatories to the International Criminal Court. So the process itself is very straightforward. In fact, it's far simpler than putting in place a whole new law at a national level, because all we're doing is making an amendment to include it with the existing international crimes on the Rome Statute. That's the governing document. It's not a complicated process. It can be done very, very fast. Our challenge is actually bringing forward the countries that are most adversely impacted by ecocide so that they can actually table that. And that's about raising funds to do that, to help them take it. So what we do is our Mission Life Force, it's like a crowdfund. It's pegged to a legal document. So you can sign up to the Earth Protectors Trust Fund document. You become an Earth Protector in law. And you gift money as a one-off, or you can give recurring funds into that pot. And that's completely ring-fenced. None of that money goes to me or my team. It 100% goes to paying for the flights, the accommodation, the food, And whatever additional aspects are required, side events or whatever is required in the United Nations or at the Assembly every year, and for all the additional meetings that happen in between. And that's purely 100% what the money is used for. I then have the challenge of raising funds for our team, for the websites, for cybersecurity, we'd love to be able to pay ourselves. All of us are gifting our time for free at the moment. We hope that changes, because as we move forward with this and as it becomes bigger, I mean, we really are talking about, at the moment, a tiny campaign that possibly has the biggest impact in the whole wide world that most people have never heard of. But once it starts to go big, then we really have to have full-time team working on this day in, day out. At the moment, it's only a few of us working full-time for free, and we'd love to change that. One of the reasons we have a challenge with funding is because what we're doing is political. It's not charitable in the UK. So foundations won't fund us, and obviously governments, we don't get state funding for what we're doing. So we are looking for patronage for people who can come forward and say, this is really important and we really want to see this happen and we're going to help you do that. So if there are any patrons out there, please come along and help us make this wonderful law happen.
Yes, please do. We need it. I want to ask more about Ecocide and the process, but you mentioned that your team will work for free. And this is an absurd notion to a lot of people, that you might work on something that you care about and essentially gift it. It's gift economy.
Absolutely.
It's like, it's kind of understanding that the world is bigger than a spreadsheet and a profit and loss account.
Absolutely.
And that your life is bigger than that. And if you can, you make a few sacrifices. But if you can give your time, then you do. How has that been in terms of finding a team that are prepared to do that? And
I mean, it was kind of interesting because in London, I used to live in London before we moved down here. My husband and I, we sold our house to fund what I'm doing. Unfortunately, we sold it at the time of complete market crash, housing market crash, and barely came out with any equity in it. But he was so good because my husband said to me, look, what you're doing is really, really vital. I 100% believe in you. Don't worry, we'll get through it. We really financially struggled for quite a few years. And I had a team. I did receive some big funding from an anonymous donor in America. Of course, with an anonymous donor, you don't know who they are. You can never go back. And so I did have a team. I did have premises, but very quickly.
Listening, we need you again.
Exactly. Please come back. But very quickly, the money, of course, runs out. And, here I was to become a professional fundraiser, which actually is not the best use of my skills. I am meant to be taking Ecocide law forward. And in the end, I had to close down my premises, and actually we downsized and we moved down here to outside Stroud, in part because it was a place where I didn't have to justify my values. People here are very keyed into what, caring for the earth. It's a normative here. We have, one of the best farmers markets in the country. A lot of people are doing pioneering work down here. It's no accident that the two main green energy companies are based down this way. It's no accident that we have, well, I mean, it may be a subjective opinion, but the best ecological circus in the world, just literally up the hill there. Gifford Circus are phenomenal. It's no accident that natural housing originated from Gaia architects, started on the high street here. So there's a lot of kind of pioneering stuff that comes from here. On a Saturday morning in the market, there'll be any number of people out there with stalls and various kind of engaging with local and global campaigns. And you can buy things at Love Loose, local shop where everything's unpackaged, for instance. Everything's organic. The Biodynamic Association is across the road. There's a lot of Steiner establishments here. So there's a certain way of engaging with life here that's normative. And so coming down here, then I was automatically engaging with a community who were very receptive to what I'm doing. Indeed, Jojo, who's really my so-called partner in crime in this, she came forward very quickly and said, in fact, she turned up here with a post-it and just kind of slapped it down and said, these are the hours I'm going to be here this week in between juggling kids that are being homeschooled. And it just went from there. And, lots of people would just kind of turn up as well, which is really fantastic. And there's been an incredible amount of goodwill. And very quickly, Jojo and I realized that if we just decouple ourselves from the idea of if only we had money, we would do this. And instead, if we looked at it the other way of what I'd really love to do is this, okay, let's make it happen, then by hook or by crook, it seems to happen. We have a lot of goodwill and a lot of people we owe money to are very, very good at saying it's okay, when it comes in, then that's fine. But we really decided that we have to get a campaign out here. Had we just taken money that come in to just pay ourselves, we would never have gotten a campaign off the ground. So we decided we were going to put this first. I mean, now we're actually saying, okay, this is not a sustainable model. We both have husbands who are not quite managing to make ends meet to allow us to do what we are doing. And we've got various people, I think you maybe met Anita, who basically has gifted her time and decided to move down here on the back of just really caring for what we're doing to help and assist with it, which is fantastic. What it does mean is that it's coming from a very altruistic place. So we're all doing it because we believe in it. We're doing it for higher purpose. It's not a 9-to-5 job, and it's about what we bring to this in terms of quality rather than sitting at a screen all day long. It's far more dynamic and interactive than that. And we accommodate and work with what is. If kids need to be here because they're not at forest school for the next couple of hours, then that's the way it is, and we just work around that. And I think that's very much a very feminine model of operating as well. There's a coming and going at different times. It's not a normal clock in at 9 and leave at 5 o'clock in the evening and the job's done. It's, for Jojo, sometimes it's when her kids are all in bed, then she'll be on the computer till 2 o'clock in the morning. For me, I'm early riser, I'll be up at 4:30 meditating before I start and doing stuff from there. So it's different patterns, but it seems to work. And because we have a very high level of trust as well with each other and of each other, then it's very... we can discern where to put our energies and what to let go of to move forward far faster. And it's good fun.
Yeah, it's like, this podcast obviously is not funded, and I do pay the team a bit to work on it, not as much as market rates, because I don't have it. But it's interesting because you can't really change the system when you're inside it sometimes, because then you're in all the other trappings of what, if you have funding for a podcast, then there's also a narrative that you're being asked to push as part of that. Doing something independent and doing something that involves more listening than doing. Involves making these kinds of personal sacrifices.
Although, it's an interesting thing, when you really care about something, it's not much of a sacrifice. It can look like a sacrifice from the outside, but actually it's all about how we perceive things. I mean, would I want to be back in London, living in the big townhouse we had? No, not in a million years. I'm so much happier. I have a phenomenal community here. We're living in the world's tiniest cottage, surrounded by the most beautiful countryside and the most fantastic neighbours. Beautiful soy sheep who have big brown curly hair and big horns and apple orchards and, cottage on an organic farm. And our neighbours are great fun. Everyone's dropping off courgettes and, fruit and vegetables that they've suddenly got too many gluts of. And there's a sense of being connected to the land here, and it feels very abundant, which is really lovely. And there's a lot of goodwill and happiness here as well. People are very grateful for having such beautiful landscape to be living in, although it may not be particularly moneyed per se. There's no sense of it being coming from a place of poverty or lack. There's a lot of, for me, there's a lot of gratitude. I feel my sense of being deeply connected to community is very, very strong. And I notice for many, many people here as well.
I think everyone's going to want to move to Stroud after listening to this.
Or create theirs.
Yeah.
I mean, when I'm traveling and speaking across the world, often I end up staying in most fantastic communities and, people who really resonate with what I'm doing. And I end up staying in eco communities or intentional communities or just, regular towns where there's an amazing community of people doing amazing stuff. And there's so many people doing amazing things. It's just fabulous to find that and tap into it and discover it and realize that actually everywhere, in London there is as well, actually, I know that.
But you just don't get people giving you apples and courgettes.
No, not in the same way. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the beauty of living in the countryside now, without a doubt. Yeah. There's far less concrete.
Yeah. So in a sense, what you're saying is it's about tapping into a kind of a more abundant sense of experience.
Yeah, and experience is exactly the right word, actually, isn't it? Because you can have a far more abundant experience in the middle of a city as well. Whether or not it's New York or downtown, somewhere in Venezuela or what have you. It is about tapping into community and finding that unity in the community, if you will, seeing what those intrinsic values are. It's the glue of life, the stuff of life, yeah.
When Ecocide is an international criminal law,
yeah,
what difference will that actually make? What will that look like?
Yeah. It's actually going to be hugely profound. There's the practical side where dangerous industrial activity will no longer be able to operate. And that means then that big companies will have a choice. If you want to continue with fossil fuel extraction, you'll end up in a criminal court of law as a CEO director facing criminal charges. There's a choice there. Do we become a renewable energy company, for instance, instead of a dirty fossil fuel company? But also it has a huge knock-on impact in other ways as well. Financiers and investors aren't going to want to invest in something that's now a criminal activity. So it means that the flow of investment will suddenly dry up. And instead, that money will flow into the innovation in another direction. It will flow into the non-harmful industrial activity. It fosters innovation and creativity and operating from a first do no harm premise at the very, very top end. So suddenly governments are not going to, by law, be able to hand out permits to, for instance, for fracking, which we have looming here in the horizon. Today in the UK, an injunction to stop the first fracking well from going ahead failed. It's going to start drilling tomorrow morning. Now, with Ecocide in place, that injunction that was sought by the conscientious protectors who are trying to stop the fracking wouldn't even need to happen because the fracking wouldn't be allowed to happen because it would be a criminal activity. It wouldn't even get off the ground. So instead of activists getting arrested as criminals...
The 3 young men that are actually serving time now.
Exactly. They're in prison for standing up to protect their communities. And you know what? They weren't even allowed to bring evidence in court to show why they were doing what they were doing. And the judge, it's just been found out today, his family and his wife are major shareholders in a company that is a service industry for the very fracking company that is continuing up there. How shocking is this?
Yeah.
So there is corruption within the system. Now, I'm not saying all judges are corrupt, far from it. I mean, here I am advocating for a law to protect the earth. But when we have judges who are actually financially benefiting from these companies from proceeding, then they ought not to be allowed to hear these cases because they have a financial interest to send the activists, the conscientious protectors, into court. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is we're training up activists. We have an ecological justice program, and we're training them up so they can argue on, as it's a human right, the right to freedom of conscience. And that's enshrined in our Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in Europe, in our European Convention on Human Rights. And under that article, you have the right to freedom of conscience. So last century, it was conscientious objectors. Now, first of all, when they stood up, they were put to prison, just like our three here who have just been put in prison for standing up to try and stop fracking. And those conscientious objectors, they argued that I'm doing it on point of conscience. I'm objecting to the serious harm that is war. Just like our conscientious protectors are doing this, saying, I am objecting. I'm going one step further. I am protecting my community against the serious harm that is fracking. And here's the thing, the conscientious objectors, they won. It took quite a lot of them getting arrested and going to prison. But eventually it got to the point that it was recognized that they had a human right. So not only did it switch from them being criminals, but then they were protected by law, and it was enshrined as a human right, freedom of conscience. And we're now arguing, just like the conscientious objectors, now we have conscientious protectors. And one of the reasons that we're doing these training sessions, we're having one on Tuesday here for a whole group of activists, is so that this doesn't happen again and again and again, that they end up in front of judges who refuse to hear the evidence of the serious harm and refuse to actually accept that there is any justification for them standing up and doing it, so that they can go into a court of law and say, I am doing this because I'm exercising my right to freedom of conscience to protect my planet, to protect my community. And so that judge then has to hear evidence of what that harm is. And if the judge does have a conscience, then he will acquit. So in a way, what we're doing, we're wanting to protect the protectors who are on the front line and to skill them up so that they know what to do here, so that many of them are representing themselves either through financial constraints or because they just don't have decent legal representation that will put forward these legal arguments for them. You know, it's a challenge. We've got a government that's cutting legal aid, that's making justice, access, the route to justice harder and harder every day. But that's why we gift it for free as well, because often those who are on the front line are living in the gift economy. And so we don't want to exclude anyone just because we don't have funds. We've decided we're going to do it regardless, come what may. And so we just offer this skilling up and this training so that those who are on the front line can then be skilled up, prepared for, when they get arrested, rather than it being game over, saying, okay, now's my opportunity to step up and speak out in a court of law and take the judges on a journey of expanding their conscience so they start to recognise what's happening here and that indeed there is missing law. When ecocide is a crime, then they wouldn't even end up in court. In fact, the police would be thanking them for bringing it to their attention, so they could go straight in and stop the dangerous industrial activity. But the dangerous industrial activity with ecocide crime being in place wouldn't even get off the ground because the finance wouldn't be there. Investors would find it untenable. Governments won't give the permits. And the lack of civil license, society at large would just say this is a crime, this cannot be permitted. So in a way, what we're doing is we're galvanizing people to I speak out to say I refuse to give social license for this to proceed. At the moment, that's a challenge, hence activists are arrested. But the more people who stand up and speak out, then the more unacceptable it becomes. And the easier it becomes then for a law to actually be taken forward to say, now this must be criminalised. If you like, what we're doing is we're shining a light on the truth. We're speaking truth to power. And we're doing this in a way that comes from a place of deep care, of deep love for the earth. And that's a very strong and powerful energy. That's an alchemical energy. It's a constructive energy rather than a destructive force. So it's how we harness our life force, our own energy, if you like. One of the reasons why we called our campaign Mission Life Force is about how we harness our own life energy. Do we decide that it's going to be just to remain complicit in a world that is destructive? Or do we decide that we will stand up collectively and stand for a greater force? We're aligning the force of law with the force of life, if you like. It's a higher force, it's a higher energy. In that way, we will actually protect the lives of millions of people in the future. We can actually, the beauty is with climate breakdown, is that we can do something to help mend that problem. You know, if something is broken down, it can be fixed. And we can do that by actually removing what the harm is, but also making good. And that's about the restorative justice. That's about going back in and then healing the land that's been destroyed, planting the trees, but also making sure that those trees that are planted, the biodiversity that's put back in, is protected as well, so that it's not just riven asunder all over again by the next dangerous industrial activity coming in to cut down the Amazon or what have you. So it's a hugely, hugely powerful law. I mean, it's a massive game changer, economically, politically, business-wise, but also it's a huge game changer in terms of raising consciousness, because what it is doing is it's making very conscious, making very explicit what the harm is and what we choose to say no to. Just as we did with genocide, we get to a point and we face that shadow and we give it a name and we say, enough, no more now. Now we outlaw that. And just as we did with apartheid, abolition of slavery, civil rights movement, it's the same thing. It has to, you have to shine a light on the truth of it for it to be recognised that this must now end. And then we outlaw it, we criminalise it. Yeah.
So on one hand, it feels like, you know, you think of just how much consuming we're doing and all of these little battles, quite big little battles, fracking, ocean plastics, all of these different things. And then there's also this, but it could just change tomorrow. Like it's that simple. Those things have happened throughout history and surprised us.
Tipping points, very much. I mean, I remember when I was in Vienna when I was 21, and there was a lot of news about the Berlin Wall, and saying to my friend's father, do you really think that the Berlin Wall will come down? And he said, no, that'll never happen in our lifetimes. 3 weeks later, it happened. And 3 days after that, we were at dinner and he was saying, well, of course it was always going to happen. And I realized subsequently that what happened there was that it was the tipping point. His viewpoint shifted after it happened. The impossible became possible, and then it became completely a new normative for him. But there were certain people on the front line that had already grasped that the impossible will become possible and indeed made it happen. You know, they were the ones that were there that actually pulled down the wall. And they were already, they had the vision of what was possible already in place. They were the innovators, you know, the early adopters who knew what was possible, and they were gonna make it happen. They were the change makers. My friend's dad, he wasn't the change maker, but once it had changed, he was perfectly happy with it. Yeah. He was glad, you know. But the change makers are the ones that actually go out there and say, enough, no more, and they stand up. And they decide to protect what's better, you know, for a better world.
It's the importance of us having our vision.
Yes.
And our values.
Yes, exactly. Very much so.
we are taking just a short pause here. If you are enjoying this episode, please consider joining our community. For a small contribution, you can be part of our beautiful online world, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and practice. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show, and you receive a number of benefits, such as special member-only events and discounts on all our courses, retreats, and in-person experiences. You will have membership to our app and connect with inspiring humans around the world through a social network to discuss the themes of the show away from the eyes of advertisers and the manipulation of big tech. Our membership is what makes us able to stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. And it is the very heart of all that we are. Head to www.allthatweare.org/support to find out more. You talk about in your book, it's a lot about the personal ecocide and our relationship with harming ourselves.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about how that fits together with what's happening on a bigger scale?
Yeah, I got to a point where I realized that ecocide is not just an external serious harm, but we can actually have our own internal ecocides. You know, what are our patterns of harm that are preventing us from stepping into our higher purpose, if you will. And, you know, it can be as simple as that little voice saying, you can't do that, it's not possible, you know, who are you to dare to speak out? And of course, these are all, you know, the inhibitors. These are all the shadows, the dark shadows that, you know, is kind of, you know, the devil and the angel on our shoulders. And who's going to win this round? The one saying you can't do that, or the one that says you won't know until you try, until you step out. In a way, it's about becoming conscious of that and saying, I choose to let go of that negative narrative. I choose to cancel that. That's not the narrative I'm going to listen to. And very proactively, you know, cutting those cords and stepping away from it. When we do that, we actually, it's a process of deeper inquiry and a heightened self-awareness of, gosh, I have got this narrative going on in my head, and I'm going to stop that. You know? So in a way, it's about how we take charge of our own lives. And when we do that, we start to take full responsibility for our own lives as well. So if we can do that, what we find is that we step into our fullness, if you will. And by doing that, life becomes so much more great. It's so much more, you're stepping into the adventure. You're stepping into the capacity to really engage with a life extraordinary, rather than just a life most ordinary. I mean, I remember someone saying to me, I undertook the Hoffman process, which is phenomenal, kind of fast track, you know, face your shadow self and, you know, unlock those traumas. And I had a fantastic teacher, Matthew, and he said, it's not about feeling better. It's about getting better at feeling. So that really resonated with me, because actually, if you try to submerge the uncomfortable feelings, then the numbing out happens, and then you lose the capacity to care. And when you lose the capacity to care, then you make decisions that cause harm. Because if you have the capacity to care and you can feel, then you're not going to want to cause harm. And that's very important. So if you can feel, and you can feel very deeply, whether or not it's the terrible pain and anguish of what's going on, or whether or not it's intense love and bliss or happiness, then you have the capacity to do something really great with your life. So the more that we are able to allow ourselves to feel whatever it is in that spectrum, means that we are capable of experiencing, whether or not it's deep pain, then we can feel deep bliss as well. And that capacity to feel is vitally important to understanding how then we can use that, harness that energy for greater good. If we can feel deep pain at what's happening, then we can take that and we can use that as a force to nourish us, to move forward, to do something far better, to make a better world.
Absolutely. And it's, we have this obsession with just wanting to be good all the time.
Yeah.
And everything's great, I'm great, everything's great. And I teach yoga and meditation. I do intuitive therapy work with people and their sort of subconscious patterning.
Yeah.
I cry all the time.
Me too.
I make a mess most of the time because I'm open, I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And I mean, a mess, that's kind of being derogatory for comedy reasons, but it's like having to relinquish this idea of there being this sort of this good level, and actually understanding that if you're alive, if you're awake, then you're gonna feel like what's going on in the world,
exactly,
and on both extremes and everything in between. And I know that something that we have in common is that we don't watch the news or listen to the news or read newspapers. I think I've been doing this for years now. I think it was a spiritual teacher, I can't even remember which one, that said don't watch the news. And
I completely agree with that.
And I had a kind of fear of like, oh, but I won't know what's going on, and then I won't be intelligent and educated and be able to contribute to conversations. I find that, when I watch the news, it brings in so much fear into my body. And that makes it harder to feel. But it also means that I've just got this narrative that is a narrative of my life that isn't actually of my life. And that's definitely a huge motivator for me in creating this show, is that there are so many other stories and narratives that we can be part of. Why do you not watch the news and engage in the news? What do you feel like it does for you?
It's not truth. For me, it was a propaganda machine most of the time. And I was actually in Vancouver airport one time, and there were big television screens up showing Fox News or something. And there was this woman giving a narration of some terrible disaster that had happened. And you saw US troops, running across tarmac or what have you. And I remember thinking, oh God, what's happened in the world? Is there another, crisis or conflict? It was kind of on a feedback loop, this every 3 minutes, the same story was coming up. And I actually, after a while, began to realize that what I was hearing was a story that was about something quite mundane, and that there had been a resolution, but it was told in a way that had my heart beating, thinking that something big and awful had happened. And I realized that it was actually physically impossible for this story to be told on Fox News, to contextualize it in a positive and calm way, that it had to be at this kind of high octane, bad, conflict. But it took time to think through the real content of it, to say, actually, this is not a bad thing. A moment of real realization that there was a kind of over dramatization going on, for want of kind of feeding a sort of anxiety. A lot of people are trapped in this kind of constant state of trauma. And I just thought, I'm not having this. I don't want this. I want to discern what matters to me and engage with what matters with me, because it's like noise. It was noise. It was really a very important moment for me to say, enough, no more. I'm not listening to this mainstream news. And it's a weapon, you see. It's a weapon, the weapon of 21st century. It doesn't have to be guns anymore. The attack on is widespread and systematic through news, through disinformation. It's deliberate manipulation of facts, for instance, around climate change, that's been going on for decades now, that keeps people in a constant state of fear, confusion, anxiety, I mistrust, and not knowing where the truth lies. And when you have society in that state, you can do whatever you like. So I realized that if I decoupled myself from that, then I could discern internally what mattered and what was of value and what spoke to me as true and what didn't. Actually, by creating that space, then again, it's about kind of how I choose to self-authorize in my own life, what I choose to engage in and what I don't. And, important stuff does come through. People do get in touch, say, Polly, you got to know this. And, I do look at my tweets occasionally and things like that. It's surprising how much really is just noise. My husband said to me at first, but you're really going to need to know what's going on in the news. And I said, okay, I tell you what, why don't you tell me once a week all the good stuff that's happened this week? And he couldn't tell me anything that was good news. So this prioritization that's happening of negative news, and even if it's positive, it's turned into a negative story. I decided I refuse to remain complicit in this. It's corrupt, and I don't want to have part of that. And as a result, actually, my life feels far fuller because it's not filled with nonsense. And it is literally no sense. It doesn't make sense, most of it. And I don't want to spend my whole time engaging with stuff that seems to be just a madness. Yeah. Life is short. I want to fill it with what matters to me. Yeah.
Absolutely. I often find that there are some people do these roundups at the end of the year. They tell you all the amazing, beautiful things that have happened in the world that you didn't know.
Yeah. And this is fantastic. I mean, Positive News here in the UK is a great magazine for that. It's very important to know what's going on in terms of other communities creating, the new story, if you like, the new world that I am participating in, and I want to know that others are participating in as well. Yeah. I don't particularly want to continually engage in an old story narrative of disinformation and deliberate fake news, of scandals, of traumas, of dramas that have no bearing on the way I live and operate in my life.
Yeah, and just in a similar way of the story of the judge, like who owns the newspapers and the news channels, and what's their reason for existence.
Exactly. Yeah.
We are already at the end of our time. It's gone by so fast. Can you leave us with some ways in which we can tap into that greatness within ourselves?
Yeah. Well, this is something that I do every day, and it started off as a bit of experiment, and we're all doing it here now. I love it, and so I think it's really important. Earthing. Have you heard of earthing?
Yeah.
So, just go out bare feet and put your tootsies into the earth, just even for a moment or two, but with consciousness, consciously send love and gratitude to the earth. Invite that back in. And it's like plugging in to the earth. Yeah. If you're listening to this, if you've gotten this far in this podcast, then you're already a protector. And I'm inviting you to become an earth protector in law. So, come and join us on missionlifeforce.org to put in place a law to protect the earth. And a third thing, I think I'm a great believer in conscious intent. And I'm doing this thing at night now where I've actually got it written down in a little post-it. 5 things I'm grateful for in the day and 5 wishes I wish to put out there. And it's great because you end up falling asleep with a smile on your face, which I'm sure must translate into our dream world as well. And then I wake up feeling really ready for a good day and nip outside and put my feet on the earth again.
Well, thank you so much, Polly. I feel like we could have talked for more hours very easily.
Yeah.
But I look forward to coming and talking to you again, hopefully in the not too distant future when Ecocide is an international law.
Yeah, well, thank you, and it's been an absolute delight, really. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and spending your time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. For less than a tea or coffee a day, you can access our community conversations and benefits such as our app and member gatherings, as well as being a patron whose support makes this podcast happen. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others find us. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.